I never imagined a simple knock on my door would unsettle old routines, stir forgotten questions, and leave me awake long after the lights were off. What began as an ordinary favor turned into a quiet moment that followed me for years, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed inside me. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was a late afternoon in early fall, the kind where the sunlight feels gentle instead of demanding. I had just set my teacup down by the kitchen window, watching leaves gather along the curb like they were having a quiet meeting of their own. My neighborhood has always been calm, mostly retirees like me, people who wave politely and keep their lives neatly trimmed. That's why the knock surprised me. It was light, almost hesitant, as if whoever stood on the other side wasn't quite sure they should be there. When I opened the door, I saw my neighbor from 2 houses down. I'd noticed him before, of course. He was younger than most around here, polite in that thoughtful way, always carrying groceries for his grandmother when she visited. He smiled, a little embarrassed, and asked if I might have some sugar. His voice was steady, but his eyes held that look people get when they're new somewhere, still learning how to ask. I invited him in, not thinking much of it. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from something I'd baked earlier, and the radio murmured softly in the background. As I reached into the cabinet, I felt suddenly aware of how quiet it was, how rarely I had company these days. We exchanged small talk, the safe kind, about the weather and the way the street changes color every season. Nothing important, and yet everything felt a bit more present. He lingered a moment longer than necessary, thanking me twice, then commenting on a framed photograph on the wall. It was an old picture, taken years ago, of me standing by a lake, laughing at something just out of frame. I hadn't thought about that day in ages. He asked where it was taken, and as I answered, I realized how long it had been since someone asked me a question that wasn't routine. There was no rush, no sense of crossing a line, just a calm pause that settled between us. I noticed how carefully he listened, how he nodded not to be polite, but to understand. When he finally turned to leave, sugar tucked under his arm, he thanked me again, this time with a sincerity that felt heavier than the small favor I'd given. After the door closed, the house felt different. Not emptier, but fuller somehow, as if a window had been opened inside me. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the radio hum and the clock tick, thinking about how easily we move through our days without noticing the quiet moments that shape us. I didn't know it then, but that simple visit had already planted a question in my mind, one that would grow gently, asking me to look at my own life with fresh eyes. That evening, after dinner dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, and the sky outside had faded into a soft gray blue, I found myself replaying the visit in my mind, not in a restless way, but with a quiet curiosity that surprised me. I had lived alone long enough to grow comfortable with silence, to treat it like an old friend. Yet now, the silence felt different, as if it were waiting for something to be said. Over the next few days, I noticed him more. Not in a deliberate way, but naturally, the way you start to notice a song playing faintly in the background once you've heard it before. I'd see him watering the small patch of lawn in front of his house, or unloading groceries from his car with careful attention, as if each task mattered. When our paths crossed, he always greeted me with the same warmth, never rushing, never distracted. Those brief exchanges became small markers in my day, moments I quietly looked forward to without admitting it to myself. One morning, while I was trimming the rose bush near my porch, he stopped by again. This time there was no request, no excuse. He simply asked how I was doing. The question caught me off guard. People often ask that without expecting an answer, but the way he asked made it feel different, as if he genuinely wanted to hear it. I found myself answering honestly, talking about the aches that come with age, about how mornings feel heavier than they used to, and how afternoons can still surprise me with their beauty. He listened without interrupting, leaning lightly against the railing, the autumn air cool and clean between us. Then he shared a little about himself, about moving here for a fresh start, about feeling caught between who he had been and who he hoped to become. His words weren't dramatic, just thoughtful, and they settled in me like pebbles dropped into still water, sending gentle ripples outward. As the days passed, these conversations became a quiet routine. Sometimes it was just a wave, other times a few minutes talking about books, music, or the way time seems to move faster the older you get. I was careful with my thoughts, reminding myself of boundaries and of the years that separated our lives. And yet there was something grounding in these talks, something that reminded me I was still capable of being seen not as a role or a memory, but as a person in the present moment. One afternoon, he brought over a small bag of sugar, insisting on returning what he'd borrowed. I laughed and told him it wasn't necessary, but he smiled and said it mattered to him. As he handed it to me, our conversation drifted to the idea of kindness, how small gestures can carry more weight than we realize. Standing there with the familiar walls of my home behind me and the open street ahead, I felt a quiet realization forming. This wasn't about sugar, or chance meetings, or even companionship. It was about connection, about the simple truth that life still has ways of reaching us, no matter our age, if we're willing to open the door. As the season shifted, so did something inside me. The leaves thinned out on the trees, and mornings arrived with a sharper chill, the kind that makes you pause before stepping outside. Our conversations didn't grow louder or more frequent, but they grew deeper, like a river narrowing yet gaining strength. There was comfort in that rhythm, in knowing that a few exchanged words could steady an entire day. One evening, a power outage swept through the neighborhood just as dusk settled in. Streetlights blinked off, and the familiar glow from windows disappeared one by one. I lit a few candles and sat by the living room window, watching shadows stretch and soften along the walls. That was when I heard another knock, firmer this time, still respectful. It was him, checking in, making sure I was all right. The concern in his voice was genuine, uncomplicated. I invited him to sit for a moment, the candlelight filling the room with a warm, steady glow. We talked quietly, mindful of the stillness outside, sharing stories that felt more personal than before. I spoke about my marriage, long ended not in anger, but in quiet drifting apart. I admitted how strange it felt to wake up some mornings unsure of who I was without the roles I'd spent years fulfilling. Saying those words out loud felt like setting down a heavy bag I'd carried longer than I realized. He didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. He simply listened, the way people rarely do anymore. In return, he shared his own uncertainties, his worries about choosing the right path, about time slipping by faster than expected. Despite the difference in our years, there was a shared understanding in that moment, a recognition that everyone, at some point, stands at a crossroads wondering which way to turn. When the lights finally flickered back on, neither of us rushed to end the conversation. There was a calm awareness between us, a mutual respect that needed no explanation. As he stood to leave, he thanked me, not for the company, but for the honesty. After the door closed, I sat alone again, yet I didn't feel alone. I felt clearer. That night, lying in bed, I realized something important. This connection wasn't about filling a void or rewriting the past. It was about recognizing my own voice again, hearing it steady and true. Whatever came next, I knew it would be guided by that understanding, by the quiet strength that comes from being fully present in your own life. The following weeks passed gently, without any sudden turns, and I was grateful for that. Life returned to its familiar pace, yet it no longer felt dull or predictable. Something had shifted, not outwardly, but within me. I moved through my days with a little more awareness, noticing the sound of my footsteps in the hallway, the way morning light settled on the kitchen table, the comfort of making choices simply because they felt right. We continued to greet each other as neighbors do. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't, and that felt perfectly natural. There was no expectation attached to our interactions, no unspoken demand for more. And that, I realized, was what made it meaningful. We had shared a moment of honesty, and it had done its work quietly, without needing to grow into something else. One afternoon, as I was walking back from the mailbox, he stopped to tell me he'd be moving soon. A new opportunity had come up, one he felt ready to take. I listened, genuinely happy for him. There was no sadness in the exchange, only a calm acceptance, the kind that comes when you understand that people enter your life for reasons you don't always see at first. When he left, the street looked the same as it always had. The houses stood quietly, the trees bare now, winter close. I went inside, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window where this story had begun. I thought about how easy it is to believe that meaningful moments belong only to youth or to grand events. Yet here I was later in life, reminded that growth doesn't ask for permission from age. What stayed with me wasn't his face, or his voice, or even the conversations themselves. It was the reminder that I was still capable of reflection, still open to understanding myself in new ways. That a simple knock, a small request, could invite me to look inward and see a woman who was still learning, still evolving. Years have passed since then, but the lesson remains clear. Life doesn't always change us through dramatic moments. Sometimes it speaks softly, through kindness, respect, and brief connections that leave a lasting imprint. And when I think back on that day, I don't think about sugar at all. I think about how unexpectedly, beautifully, I was reminded that my story was still unfolding.